And now it's time for the sponsor perspective portion of our program. Before we get going, a quick clarification. While I'm conducting this interview and the questions are mine, the content of this portion of the event shouldn't be considered editorial. With that, I'd like to welcome Laurie Self. Laurie is Senior Vice President and Counsel of Government Affairs with Qualcomm. Laurie, it's great. I know you're in San Diego area, and the light is great there, and so we're very jealous. You are in San Diego, right?
I'm actually based in our DC office. I'm in my home in Northern Virginia.
I'm so sorry for that.
Right,
well, I was hoping you were in San Diego, where I visited Qualcomm many times. So goof there, but yeah, the weather sucks today in Washington. But anyway, Laurie, let me ask you a question. You know, today, what I've been very committed to do is have a conversation, as I was trying to have with Congressman Davis, that looks at waterways, roads, transportation, bridges, and all of this, but it just feels so antiquated to me, and I want us to understand that broadband, 5G, the retrofitting, the sensors, the big data, and the connectivity that we're all also talking about has to be part of this conversation. Can you share with us how Qualcomm has made that conversation finally possible?
Yeah, so let me just, for those who don't know Qualcomm, we are the world's leading developer of wireless cellular technology. So when we think about each generation of cellular technology, 2G, 3G, 4G, now the 5G era, it's our inventions that kind of underlie that systems-wide cellular architecture. And so, you know, the research and development that goes into these cellular communications platforms is incredible, and that's really been our role, to be that R&D engine for the 5G ecosystem, and also to anticipate what 5G needs to deliver in order to become that resilient, ubiquitous cellular infrastructure. And, you know, as you're talking about different kinds of physical infrastructures, I think what's apparent today more so than ever is that connectivity is the critical infrastructure for the 21st century, and cellular provides that robust connectivity. And of course, as we move further into the 5G era, we'll see cellular 5G technologies make existing physical infrastructures smarter, more efficient, more resilient, more secure. And of course, we'll also see an incredible revolution in different verticals that will be enabled by 5G, including automotive and factories of the future and so forth.
I mean, it's staggeringly large. And when you look at what the amount, I mean, when you talk about going from 4G to 5G, people don't understand it's not an increment. It's a strategic leap, right, in terms of what is going to get processed. So I think it's hard for many folks to get their head around it. But one of the other areas they can get their head around is the fact that so much connectivity is tough today, that we have, particularly in the United States, a divide between rural and urban areas. We have areas in urban cities that are not connected. Do you see a pathway I mean, we have to learn a new lexicon, right? Millimeter wave and new technologies that are going to become part of this conversation that we need to help inject in our conversation. Are we going to be able to leapfrog, do you believe, over some of these structural inadequacies in our connectivity?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, as we talk, you mentioned millimeter wave. That is one of those groundbreaking 5G technologies that we think will become that pathway to overcoming the connectivity divide in rural America and other underserved parts of our country. And we're already doing pilots using millimeter wave technologies in parts of rural America. And what we're finding is that, you know, these cellular technologies that can be efficiently deployed by local carriers with great productivity gains also bring incredible data rate speeds to rural communities. So really phenomenal increases in connectivity in parts of the country that have been underserved for many years now. And so we think of 5G as almost being the equivalent of what we saw in the early 20th century, where, you know, significant strides were made to bring electricity to parts of the country that were, you know, essentially living in a 19th century world. We're in kind of a similar place right now in the 21st century, where by bringing these cellular technologies to the country overall, we're really going to provide incredible access to technology in places that have been really, missing out on those incredible advances. And of course, COVID has brought all of that into the spotlight for so many parts of our country.
Well, look, Laurie, we're going to go completely off script here because I want to share a little bit of my own relationship with Qualcomm. I mean, when 30 years ago, when I was a young guy in Los Angeles, I met Erwin Jacobs, and he became a $500 a year corporate member of the Japan America Society. This was a time when, if you go back to the press, nobody thought what Qualcomm would succeed. They thought it was going to be a company that didn't make it. Interesting idea near UCSD. But if you go to the Patent and Trademark Office and you look at the greatest innovators in the country, if you go to the museum at Qualcomm today and you see how you were part of CB radios and Motorola things and beepers and gadgets here and there, it's a story of innovation and risk. And I want to inject that in the conversation and ask you about 5G, because a lot of people think 5G just happened. The government said just happened. I know that's not true, but I think you can tell that story better than I can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you mentioned Dr. Jacobs. I mean, he is one of Qualcomm's founders, our first CEO, and really the visionary in understanding the potential for cellular communications when the company was founded in 1985. And really, he has kind of set the tone in the mission for the country throughout our history, really that focus on research and development, understanding the potential for cellular communications, understanding how it can be that transformative technology, but also willing to make those big, long horizon R&D investments. And so, I think it's important for the audience to understand that these investments are funded by the private sector. Qualcomm does not receive, significant government funding. We make those investments through our own revenues. And we're looking at technologies that, first of all, often are defying the law of physics, as one Stanford professor kind of iconically put it in the early days of Qualcomm, claiming that our technology was, essentially not possible. And we've defied those expectations throughout our history. And 5G was a very similar dynamic where we made the decision years ago that cellular communications could evolve to create a 5G architecture that was really about device-device communications, expanding available spectrum through millimeter wave technologies, creating an environment that could justify, very dense networks of devices communicating to other devices with new technologies that enabled ultra low latency, ultra high reliability, the kinds of requirements we think about in terms of mission critical services like connected cars and telehealth and so forth. And that vision, required a significant investment in R&D, recognizing that those technologies might never bear fruit, but even if they did prove to be successful, they would not reach the marketplace for years in the future. And of course, a big part of Qualcomm's job is convincing the rest of the industry and the rest of the mobile ecosystem that these technologies have incredible value. And again, I think we're living in a moment in time where that recognition of why 5G is such an essential connectivity fabric is really at the forefront of these conversations around infrastructure. So when we think about investments in infrastructure, we think there has to be that focus on cellular infrastructure in addition to all the other forms of infrastructure that we kind of think about in our daily lives.
Laurie, just finally, whether Qualcomm wanted this or not, 5G has become one of the biggest high-stakes gambles geopolitically today. It's become a big gamble for cities as they begin thinking about which direction they're going. We know the U.S.-China spats that are going on are having consequence. But I also know that the R&D system that sits in the middle of all of this, I can't imagine that it's not fragile. I know you talk to policymakers all the time. Now we have a lot of members of the public watching today. What are the biggest parts of this puzzle that we should know about making that ecosystem in these times of turbulence and change less fragile?
Yeah, and it's such an important question. I think first of all, recognizing that as the United States, we have a system of laws and values, if you will, including intellectual property rights, including a commitment to a free market, including a commitment to enabling the private sector to harness the best ideas and harness creativity to fuel R&D. And that's an incredibly advantageous position to be in. But as you say, in order for those incentives to kind of do their job in terms of encouraging long horizon R&D investments, we have to make sure that those policy foundations are strong. So I spend a lot of my day talking about intellectual property, but of course, as you're suggesting, we're now at a moment in time where it's not just a matter of, do we have a strong intellectual property system? It's looking at the intersection between research and development and national security goals and trade policies and regulatory policies. So we need to make sure that that our innovators in this country have a framework of strong policies that encourage those ongoing investments in R&D. I think the good news is that the United States is leading in the foundational 5G R&D. We have had that leadership position for decades now, and we continue to have that leadership position. But as you suggest, we can't take that for granted. These new technologies like 5G, like AI, these are not inevitable advances. These are advances that take years of commitment to research and development, the best and brightest engineers in the world. Obviously, that workforce issue has its own set of policy imperatives. So understanding how these different policies interconnect to maintain that R&D leadership position, and also understanding the incredibly important benefits of that R&D leadership position, both from an economic perspective as well as from a national security perspective.
Well, Laurie Self, Senior Vice President and Counsel, Government Affairs at Qualcomm, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today and for supporting today's program. And I'll look forward to getting out with you to the museum in San Diego, where we can both go together and enjoy a trip finally one of these days. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.